Joe Rogan rescues a dog that guides him to a life-changing discovery. The sky had turned a soft shade of orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Joe Rogan sat in his truck on the side of a dirt road, staring at the vast, empty fields stretching out before him. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening drive, a chance to clear his head after a long day. But then he heard it, a faint, desperate whimper. He rolled down the window, letting the crisp evening air fill the truck. The sound was clearer now, a muffled cry coming from somewhere nearby. Curious and concerned, Joe stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The whimpering grew louder as he approached the ditch by the roadside. There, tangled in a mess of thorns and weeds, was a dog, a thin, scrappy mutt with patches of muddy fur and eyes that shimmered with a mix of fear and hope. Joe crouched down, his heart sinking at the sight. The dog's paw was caught in the thorns, its body trembling with exhaustion. "Hey, buddy," Joe said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "Let's get you out of there." The dog flinched at first, but didn't resist as Joe carefully worked to free its paw. It was bleeding, but not too badly. A quick fix with some bandages. The dog let out a low whine, its tail wagging slightly despite its pain. Joe smiled. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" As he carried the dog back to his truck, he noticed something odd. The dog's collar, though worn and faded, had a strange symbol etched into the metal, a circle with a line through it. There was no name, no address, just that symbol. Joe felt a twinge of curiosity. "Where did you come from, huh?" he muttered, as he placed the dog gently on the passenger seat. But as the truck rumbled to life and Joe turned onto the main road, he had no idea that rescuing this dog would lead him on a journey that would change his life forever. Joe pulled into his driveway as the last streaks of daylight disappeared. The dog lay quietly on the passenger seat, its head resting on its paws, eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Joe carried it inside, setting it on an old blanket near the fireplace. He fetched some water and scraps of leftover chicken, which the dog devoured like it hadn't eaten in days. "You've had a rough time," Joe said, watching the dog closely. "But we'll figure this out." The strange symbol on the collar lingered in his mind. He snapped a picture of it with his phone, planning to look it up later. As the dog settled down, its tail wagging faintly, Joe noticed something peculiar. Every time he moved toward the kitchen, the dog would perk up, whining softly and glancing toward the front door. "Something out there?" Joe asked, his voice low. The dog stood, its ears twitching, and padded to the door. It barked once, sharp and purposeful, then looked back at Joe as if urging him to follow. "You want me to go out there?" Joe hesitated but grabbed a flashlight. The dog darted ahead the moment the door opened, moving with surprising speed despite its earlier injuries. Joe followed, his boots crunching against the gravel path as the flashlight's beam sliced through the darkness. "Slow down, buddy," he called. The dog led him down the same dirt road where he'd found it, weaving through tall grass and bushes until it stopped abruptly near an old rusted gate. Beyond the gate lay an overgrown path leading into a dense patch of trees. Joe's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the area with his flashlight. "Why here?" he murmured. The dog barked again, pawing at the gate. Joe hesitated. This felt off, but something about the dog's urgency compelled him forward. He pushed. The gate opened with a groan of rusted hinges and stepped onto the path. The flashlight revealed a forgotten trail littered with fallen branches and tangled vines. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed eerily quiet. The dog stayed close, occasionally glancing back to ensure Joe was following. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened into a small clearing. At its center stood an abandoned cabin, its wooden exterior weathered and covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. "You've got to be kidding me," Joe muttered. The dog barked again, this time circling the cabin. Joe approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating faint claw marks on the door. Pushing it open, he was greeted by the musty smell of decay and damp wood. The dog headed straight for a pile of old blankets in the corner of the room, pawing at them furiously. Joe stepped closer, his pulse quickening. He knelt down and moved the blankets aside, revealing a small metal box covered in dust. "What's this?" Joe whispered, brushing off the grime. The box was locked, but the latch was fragile. With a firm tug, it snapped open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers and a small, leather-bound journal. Joe flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. As he scanned the handwritten notes, the journal detailed something bizarre, a series of maps and entries about hidden artifacts, coded symbols, and what the writer called a network of secrets. The same symbol etched on the dog's collar appeared on nearly every page. "What is this?" Joe muttered, his hands trembling slightly. The dog whined, nudging Joe's arm as if to remind him of its presence. "This is why you brought me here?" Joe asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What am I supposed to do with this?" A sudden rustling outside the cabin made him freeze. He killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The dog growled low, its body tense as it moved. To stand between Joe and the door. "Someone's out there," Joe whispered. A shadow passed by the window and Joe's heart raced. Whoever it was, they didn't knock, they didn't call out. They just stood there, still and silent. The dog barked sharply, breaking the tension. The figure outside bolted, disappearing into the woods. Joe's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the journal, stuffed it into his jacket, and whispered to the dog, "Let's go." They sprinted back down the trail, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the night. By the time they reached Joe's truck, his chest was heaving, and the dog was panting heavily. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his mind racing. Who was that? And why did they seem interested in the cabin? As he drove home, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dog curled up on the seat beside him, its eyes closed as if its job was done, for now. But Joe knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just some stray dog. This was a guide, leading him towards something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, Joe couldn't stop thinking about the journal. He sat at his kitchen table, flipping through its brittle pages. The handwriting was old and uneven, but the details were disturbingly precise. The writer described a series of strange artifacts hidden in various locations, each marked by the symbol on the dog's collar. One entry mentioned a specific artifact said to have the power to reveal the truth. There was a sketch of it, a circular object with intricate carvings, and a note, "Guarded by the loyal." Joe set the journal down, glancing at the dog lying on the floor. It seemed unusually calm, its eyes following him as if it could sense his thoughts. "You're part of this, aren't you?" Joe asked softly. The dog didn't respond, of course, but it stood up and trotted toward the door. It barked once, its tail wagging. "You want me to follow you again?" Joe sighed. "All right, buddy. Let's see where this goes." Joe packed a bag with essentials, including the journal, some food, and a flashlight. The dog led him back to the same dirt road, but this time it veered off into a different direction. They passed through a dense patch of trees, the morning sun casting long shadows on the ground. After an hour of walking, they reached a secluded area Joe had never seen before. At the center was a large stone structure, partly buried and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book. "This is it," Joe muttered, his breath hitching. The dog barked and ran toward the structure, sniffing around its base. Joe followed, his heart pounding as he inspected the carvings on the stone. The symbol from the journal was etched into the surface, along with several other markings he couldn't decipher. The dog began digging at the base of the stone, its movements frantic. Joe knelt down to help, brushing away dirt and leaves until he uncovered a small metal hatch. It looked old, but surprisingly intact. "You've got to be kidding me," Joe said, his voice barely above a whisper. With a deep breath, he pulled the hatch open. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. "Are you seriously telling me we're going down there?" he asked the dog, who wagged its tail as if in response. Joe turned on his flashlight and descended the stairs cautiously, the dog close on, his heels. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and the walls were damp and lined with strange carvings. At the bottom, they entered a small chamber. In the center was a pedestal, and sitting on it was the artifact from the journal. It was even more intricate than the sketch. Its surface gleamed despite the lack of light, and the carvings seemed to shimmer faintly. Joe approached it slowly, his flashlight beam steady. The dog stood beside him, its gaze fixed on the artifact. "This is what we came for," Joe murmured, reaching out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, a blinding light filled the room. Joe stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the artifact emitted a low humming sound. When the light faded, the room seemed different. The carvings on the walls were now glowing faintly, and a projection appeared in the air above the pedestal. It showed a map, a detailed layout of the surrounding area with several marked locations. "What is this?" Joe whispered, his eyes wide. The dog barked, snapping Joe out of his daze. It pawed at the ground, drawing Joe's attention to another detail in the projection. One of the marked locations was glowing brighter than the others, and next to it was a phrase, "The truth lies here." Joe stared at the map, his mind racing. Was this leading him to another discovery? Something even bigger than this artifact? Before he could process it, a loud noise echoed from the staircase. Footsteps, someone was coming. Joe grabbed the artifact and stuffed it into his bag, his heart pounding. The dog growled low, standing protectively in front of him. "Let's go," Joe whispered, heading for a small opening in the wall that led to a narrow tunnel. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices. "Check the chamber," one of them barked. Joe and the dog slipped into the tunnel just as a group of men entered the room. They were armed and clearly searching for something, or someone. Joe moved as quickly and quietly as he could, the dog leading the way. The tunnel twisted and turned, eventually opening up into a dense forest far from where they'd entered. Once they were safely away, Joe collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. "This is insane," he muttered, looking at the dog. "What have you gotten me into?" The dog wagged its tail as if satisfied with their escape. Joe spent the next few days poring over the journal and the map projection he'd managed to photograph before leaving the chamber. Each marked location seemed to point to something significant, but the glowing one stood out the most. He felt a strange sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The dog, who he now called Echo, stayed by his side, as loyal as ever. It was clear Echo wasn't just any dog. He was a guide, a protector, and perhaps even a key to uncovering something extraordinary. One evening, as Joe sat by the fireplace with Echo curled up at his feet, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed in just a few days. "I don't know what's out there," he said softly, scratching Echo behind the ears. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." Echo looked up at him, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed almost human. Joe smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected journey this dog had led him on. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a story that would change his life, and perhaps the world, forever. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Joe. His discovery of the artifact, the journal, and the map weighed heavily on his mind. He knew he had stumbled upon something far beyond his understanding, something that connected Echo, the loyal dog, to a purpose that seemed larger than life. Joe spent hours analyzing the map and journal, trying to decipher their secrets. The glowing location marked on the map kept pulling at his thoughts. It was situated deep in the wilderness, far from civilization. The journal described it as the heart of truth, but what that meant remained a mystery. One morning, Joe decided he couldn't wait any longer. Packing the artifact, the journal, and supplies for the journey, he set out with Echo by his side. The dog seemed energized, as though it knew this was their ultimate destination. The path was treacherous, winding through dense forests and rocky terrain. The deeper they ventured, the more isolated Joe felt. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and Echo's occasional bark. After hours of hiking, they reached the location marked on the map, a clearing surrounded by towering trees. At the center stood a massive stone archway, partially covered in moss and vines. It was ancient, its surface etched with symbols identical to those on the artifact and Echo's collar. "This is it," Joe said, his voice barely a whisper. He approached the archway cautiously, pulling the artifact from his bag. As soon as he held it up, the symbols on the arch began to glow. A low hum filled the air, growing louder, until the ground beneath his feet vibrated. Suddenly, a beam of light shot out from the center of the artifact, illuminating the space beneath the arch. The light shimmered, creating what looked like a swirling portal. Joe stepped back, his heart racing. "What is this?" he muttered, glancing at Echo. The dog barked and stepped forward, standing at the edge of the portal. It turned to Joe, its eyes filled with an unshakable determination. "You want me to go in there?" Joe asked, his voice trembling. Echo barked again, his tail wagging. Joe took a deep breath. "All right, buddy. I guess we're doing this together." With Echo by his side, Joe stepped through the portal. On the other side, they found themselves in a breathtaking landscape. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, covered in vibrant flowers and glowing trees. The air was warm and filled with a faint hum, like the world itself was alive. At the center of this strange place was a massive stone structure, an ancient temple. Echo led Joe toward it, his movements purposeful. Inside the temple, Joe found a large chamber with a pedestal similar to the one in the underground chamber. Above it floated an orb of pure light. As Joe approached, the orb seemed to respond, growing brighter. A voice filled the chamber, not a sound but a presence that spoke directly to Joe's mind. "Welcome, seeker of truth." Joe froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who are you?" "We are the keepers of knowledge," the voice replied. "You have been chosen to uncover the truths hidden within your world." Joe felt a surge of emotion, fear, awe, and a strange sense of purpose. "Why me?" "Because you listened," the voice said. "You followed the call, trusted the guide, and sought the answers. Few possess such courage." The orb began to pulse, and images flashed through Joe's mind. Visions of the artifact, the map, and the people who had tried to stop him. He saw connections he hadn't understood before, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "The truth will not be easy to bear," the voice continued, "but it is necessary for the future of your kind." Joe felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't fully understand what this truth was, but he knew it was something that could change everything. The orb dimmed, and the chamber grew quiet. Joe looked down at Echo, who wagged his tail and nudged Joe's hand with his nose. "Thank you," Joe said, his voice breaking, "for leading me here." The dog barked softly, his eyes full of warmth. Joe and Echo returned through the portal, carrying the knowledge they had gained. The stone archway closed behind them, leaving no trace of the portal's existence. In the days that followed, Joe dedicated himself to unraveling the truths revealed to him. He knew the journey wasn't over. This was only the beginning. But, with Echo by his side, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in a journey that had transformed Joe's life. Echo wasn't just a dog. He was a guide, a guardian, and a friend who had led Joe to a purpose he never knew he needed. And as Joe stared out at the horizon, the artifact in his hand, and Echo resting at his feet, he knew one thing for certain. The world would never be the same again. What do you think about Joe and Echo's incredible journey? Would you have trusted the dog's instincts and taken the leap? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories.